So welcome back. You should have now had a look at both the videos just to understand what databases are and what we expect to be doing with the create a database, which is our next point of call. The files that you've downloaded, we will be opening the first file. So effectively what I'm going to do is open or double click on the 1-1 file, and if I do that, I should get to see my database opened up as such. And the thing that you should notice as well, important, is that make sure that you actually enable content before you start modifying things. You'll probably find later, even in tests and so forth, if you open up a database that's given to you, make sure that you enable content, because it can cause problems if you don't. All right. So here is my database open. I'll just switch back to the website. So we're looking at 8.1. So if I go into 8.1, it's about creating a database. Now, the important things that we'll learn in this section are things like what is a primary key, data type, field size, input mask. So we're getting ready to actually be able to store data within our Microsoft Access database. So first point of call will be to actually create a table, and then look at using the design features and so forth. I'll explain to you there, and to save the table as the name suggests, saying client. So I'll just switch over to my database. So here is my database. Now, a few things that you should have already picked up from the previous videos. You'll have a list of objects here, database objects, and the objects are things like tables, queries, forms, reports. So you can filter. Here obviously I've got all objects, so once we start creating tables, queries and so forth, they'll be listed along here in the tree view. But these objects are under the create area, and what we'll be doing in the first session is we'll be looking for tables. We'll be working with tables and some of the properties within tables, but you should be familiar with objects being table, query, forms and reports. And later on, if you get really proficient with Microsoft Access, then you can go into actually coding stuff. So it's in VBA coding. If you do Alt F11, you can actually get to the coding window. So it gets a little bit more advanced, where you can use objects which are already running within your Windows operating system to do things like graphing, and even if you really want to, you can even connect this thing up so it does automation for, well, like even stock exchange stuff if you really need to, which I've done previously. But here in the table part, we will be creating a table. So the very first option in that we need to do is create, and we just click on table, and you notice immediately it's listed under our tables tables area. We want to save this table as named client. So the way we would do that is up here. We've actually got a save icon for a quick save, or alternatively you can even go to file, save as, and so forth. Right? So if I go back, I'm just going to click this guy, and you notice all of a sudden it's asked me, what do you want this table to be called? And I'm going to say client. Don't say clients, we just use singular within database terminology. So now my name of my table will be, my very first table will be called client. Now client, you can see here in my main view, only consists of one parameter or one field, and in databases we call the attributes. So this is actually an entity, but in a database it's called a table, and the entity has attributes, where here they're actually called fields within Microsoft Access. And the first field, by default, it creates an ID. But what we want to do is actually manipulate or modify or edit this table, right, the properties of it. So there's a number of ways we can actually go right click and go into design view. Notice the little ruler, etc. Or I can alternatively go up here and just directly click the design view, or I can even pick the different types You can see at the moment I'm in data sheet view, which is like looking at a spreadsheet, like a worksheet. Design view would take me to the modification there. And then there's another way, which is right down the bottom here. I'm in data sheet view, and I can also go into design view. So let's just click the all. And you notice now for this table, I'm not looking at the data which is saved within it in a data sheet view. I'm actually looking at where I can manipulate or create or operate on the properties of all the attributes and so forth, the fields within this table. So the first field that we'll be working with is called ID. We don't want to keep that as ID. We're going to actually say client ID. And you notice I'm not putting spaces and all this sort of rubbish in there. Just leave it with no spaces. If you want different, like many words put together, just capitalize the first letter, and that way it'll save us a lot of trouble later on, especially if you're doing VBAs type work. But anyway, so we've created, or we've updated our field to actually say this is a sorry, I'm not going to say primary key yet. This is a field which we'll be storing data into. So if I go back to data view, you always save the table. Here, it'll actually list the ID. So every time we create a client or enter a client, this number will increment, will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for us. And then we can add extra fields by going into the extra field by going into the design view and then entering the names of the extra fields. Right? Now, one thing which we should go back to our because we've just covered creating a table and the pen or ruler to actually say that we can go into the design view and so forth. One thing that we must cover is primary keys. So what are primary keys? So in basic terms, every table or entity on the planet or in a database must have at least one primary key. And what does a primary key mean? Here's 2 marks for the exam. What is a primary key? Primary key is a unique identifier of that entity, unique identifier, and is not allowed to be duplicated. Okay, so I can't have a unique identifier which is assigned 0, right? 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. That's duplicated, which means it's not unique. Or if I have an ID or an identifier which has a code saying, you know, ABC1, and if I have another object or a person come in and I assign the same code, ABC1, it's not considered a good primary key field or parameter. Right? It has to be unique. So if I'm trying to identify, let's say, 2 chairs or 3 chairs within some theatre, I can't identify them if they have the same ID. Right? So a primary key must be something unique. And for instance, a primary key for students. Right? Students, the primary key would be the student number, which is unique. No other student in RMIT will have your ID number. If I was going to take that a little bit further, let's say I've got a room full of chairs. Each chair would have to have a unique ID. And just think about it. What would you set as a primary key for a chair? Just think about it. And most people say model, and model, if I have a bunch of chairs, I can guarantee some of them will be the same model. If you talk about, you know, like a model ID and so forth, they can be duplicated, be the same for a bunch of different chairs. So ideally, we would say the serial number of the chair, because all chairs that are manufactured must have a unique serial number. The trick here is like if you're in the exam or you're doing the test and you don't know what to set as a primary key, obviously you create one yourself, and that's what's happened in our table as well. So if I go back to our database, you notice the table actually created an ID. So we said, oh, here's a table or an entity going to be called the client, and the client has to have a unique ID. Obviously, it wouldn't be first name or last name, because last name we could have 50 people called Smith, right? First name we can have a lot of people called Peter or Diana, right? So because they're not unique, can't be set as a primary key, so Microsoft Access creates one. And you can do the same thing in your test. If you can't think of what a primary key is, create one, so then you're actually in control of it, right? For instance, one more example, if I said, what's a good primary key for a driver's license? So some people would say, oh, the picture, but the picture can't be. You may have identical twins, can't tell the difference, so not a good primary key. So what you would say is the driver's license number, right? And it has to be unique. Okay, so primary key, every table or entity must have at least one primary key. So how do we set the primary key? And if you have a look here, if I click on my parameter on my field, there's a primary key, so I can set whether it's a primary key or not. And when it's set, you can see that it's actually changed to a key. I can also do right click and say primary key, set the primary key. All right, so our primary key in this case is client ID, and the next part of the session is to explain to you about the different types of numbers, because they ask us to assign the primary key as an auto number. I'll explain what that is in a second, but you'll actually see that there are a whole bunch of other types, data types, that can be set to the fields within the table, right? And here we can see that they've started putting in the extra fields. So to identify a client, we're going to need a first name, right? And the first name will have a data type, and that first name means, why do we set a data type? Is because that data type says what sort of data can you save in this field, right? And obviously in this exercise here, you can see first name, and they've said for first name we want to save in first name or allow data which is of type text. Okay, now let's go back to the primary key. If I go back to our primary key in the database, you notice the primary key there is set to auto number, right? And auto number is a special type provided in Microsoft Access, which means that it's automatically controlled by Microsoft Access. So when we create a new client, this auto number means that it will automatically increment the number in the table for the next record. All right. So what we'll have is, if I create my first client and I put in the names and so forth, let's actually just put it in. Let's put in first name, and first name we know we want to put text in it, right? So we can pick short text, which is up to 256 characters. You notice down here too, field size for short text is 255. If I do long text actually implies that you can go up to like 4 gigabytes of stuff, right? If I go numbers, I can enter numbers, but if I do numbers, then I have to say what type of number, and I'll leave it up to you guys to have a Google on what the different types are, like byte, integer, long integer, single, right up to decimal. Right? And if I pick something like large number, like date time, date time obviously will be for time fields, right? Like timestamps. Currency, and currency and number are basically the same type, but the currency automatically appends the dollar sign or euro or whatever you're using, right? Okay. All right. I'll let you guys have a look at the exercise further, but here I'll better set this back to short text. All right. And if I switch back over to my exercise for today, you'll need to enter these fields into the table, right, and set those data types for the appropriate fields. So your table at the end, once you've entered all this data, should look like the diagram over here. So first name, last name, address, suburb, etc. It should have all of those entered into the fields using the design view, not the, remember the little ruler, not the datasheet view. So enter all those, so basically enter those, assign those data types, and then field size, please enter the appropriate version or the size in the field size area here. And I'll just pause there and I'll let you do it, and then we'll continue in a second. Okay, so I'm back. I've populated all my table, and I'll just show you. I've populated my table with all the data. So from the table, they said last name should be short text and should be 120 characters that you can enter and so forth. Now, one thing you should notice is here we've got postcode, we've got mobile number. Let's say postcode, let's take that for instance. Question is, we've got four digits basically, so Australians have like 3000, right? The question should be, why didn't we set this as a number, right? And the reason is that you have to remember is we only assign number type to a field if that field is going to be used in a calculation. So only for calculations that fields that will be used in calculations. And obviously postcode we will not be using in a calculation, so we allow text. In other words, we can also have postcodes like 9000-Cal, California or something like that, right? So those should allow letters as well. So if I had something in here which would be like quantity of some like product, or let's say this person here, if we want to keep the client's weight, so the weight would actually be, say if we said, oh, they're 90 kilo, we know that maybe that weight parameter or field may be used in a calculation, so we would set that as a number. But postcode, no, we don't want it as a number because it's not going to be used in a calculation, so short text. Same thing with mobile and phone numbers. Obviously we just said phone number, but we set it as short text because we're going to do a special thing of things like formatting the numbers, so allowing things like brackets and spaces and all that sort of dashes and stuff, right? So that's why they're short text. So the next part in the exercise is, once you've filled in all the required fields, oh, and by the way, don't forget to save your data, right? There's this thing called required field. So what is a required field? Required fields means that you've probably been to a website before where it says mandatory for entering data. So if I'm going to register on a website somewhere, and they want my email and maybe they want my mobile number, right? I can't register unless I've entered those fields. Okay. So what we do in the database is we actually use the same concept by saying, if I go back to here, by saying it's a required field. So if, for instance, this client here, when I create a new client, I want to make sure that I actually have some kind of contact to them. I would say, for each client, mandatory entry is to have an email. So I would come down here to the properties, field properties, and there's a required field, and I would set that to say yes, it is required when I'm creating a new entity for client, right? So I've now made sure that if I'm going to create a new client, it's required that they enter an email. Okay. I'll leave it up to you guys to guess, or not guess, to actually pick which other type or fields that you'd really want as mandatory. For myself, I would pick the name to be mandatory, so I would say yes here, and last name, yes, yes, and I definitely want a email, and then it's up to you to say mobile or phone. Not everyone has a phone anymore, but I'd want to make sure that I'd be able to get in touch with this client. So email definitely, and mobile definitely. Okay. Yeah. So now I've got required. If I'm going to create this now, I've got required fields that have to be saved for that client. I'm going to save now. Make sure you always save. Now the next point of call, if I just have a look at datasheet view, let's go to data view. So you notice that we're building up almost like a spreadsheet view of where my new clients will be listed, right? And these are the fields which describe a client, right? So each client will have a unique ID, the primary key, then they'll have their name, address, and so forth. So each row, or each row is actually a record, and the record is a unique entity for client. So I might have 1,000 rows here, so that means 1,000 clients are in my client table. Okay, let's go back to the design view. Now, what I want to see is in let's say for what we're going to do is we're going to use this thing called the input mask, right? An input mask. And what you'll actually see is there are, Microsoft Access has two two sort of like features on each data element that you've saved within it. There's an input mask, which means that we can provide a format for a person to input data into a field. Okay, so that's an input mask. And the other one is to format the display of data. So my data in the database could be like capitals and spaces and uppercase, whatever, and I can actually then say display that data in this format. So there's a display which is looking at the data, and there's input mask which says how to enter the data, what format you want. So let's have a look at the input mask first, and we're going to look at the mobile telephone, right? And the mobile telephones, we know that the data entry for Australian mobiles is 4 leading digits. Then we have 3 and 3 straight after it. So what we want to do is say, if you're entering data, I want you to put 4 in, and then there'll be a space, and there'll be 3 and 3, so it actually is presentable later when we view it. So how do we do an input mask? So let's switch. And I'm in my database, so I'm going to go to the mobile area. And you notice in the property field there's an input mask here. So input mask, and if I hit the 3-dotter, I'll actually get the input mask editor. So I know for my mobiles what I want is 4 digits, space 3 digits, space 3 digits. So I can just pick any one of these, or whatever, right? Go next, and I know that my input mask here, I want it to be, this is probably the worst editor in the world, just despise it. So it's 4 digits, space, 3 digits, space, 3 digits. And I can try the input mask down here, and you can actually see it, right? So I can go 8888888, works beautifully, right? So if I go back, because I've said zeros, it means that I'm entering digits, right? I can't type letters, so I'll try and type letters, and it won't let me. The only thing it'll let me do is type digits, okay, because I've put zeros. If I put A's in here, then I can put actually I'll leave it up to you guys to have a look what sort of parameters you need to allow characters and numbers. So I'm happy with this format here. I'll go next. Do you not hate that? The value you entered is inappropriate. Okay, let's just do the old back. Go back. Pick this guy. Do it next again, and it likes all its digity stuff. Right? So I'm just going to go 0. Get rid of that, and I'm going to say 0 0 0. And I'm going to get rid of one of these. Let's try it. We'll actually, oh, sorry. Get rid of that mandatory. Yep. I'm going to try it. is it still giving me? It's probably the worst editor in the world. I know you guys will hate me after this. Okay, it works. I'll go next. Okay. So be careful with the editor. You can see how fiddly it is if you just delete it. The alternative is that you can go to the website and paste the string which I've provided with you. But what we want to do is, once you've created the input mask, to actually save in the database using that format for this exercise. Later on, when you get more proficient, you won't want to save the format because you want to be in control of how you actually see the data, and you'll just save it in raw format, which will be all the digits, no spaces, brackets or anything, right? So here I'll just go next, save, save, save. So you notice it's completed my string for me, and that's what I was complaining about before, the semicolon, slashes and so forth, right? If you're still having problems with this guy, I recommend you go over to the exercise and actually copy. You can actually copy this guy here, right? Copy, and then paste it into your input mask. Go here, yeah, we'll save the thing. I can just go next, and here I'll just paste it. Next, and we want to save it with the digits. Right. So now, if I actually go back to my datasheet view, if I click in here, you notice I've already got the formatting, so I'm going to be entering the data. It actually tells me this input, it has to be in this format. Okay, so that's input mask. Let's go back here. Alright, switch over to our exercise. They want us to do, you guys can do the next part, which is actually create an input mask for the phone number. And the phone number, what we want to see is the interstate code, so 02 for Sydney, 03 for Melbourne, wrapped with brackets. So your input mask will be bracket 00 to allow digits, close bracket, space, and then we want 4 digits and 4 digits for normal telephone numbers. So we want to see this format when we actually enter the data, and that is the input mask for that entry, so that we actually see that kind of data. I'll let you guys do that for yourself, right? And I'll just continue on to try and finish this section of the exercise by showing you how do you capitalize. Previously I said there's an input mask, so you show a format how you want the data to be entered into the database, and then there's also the format property, which means how do you see the data which is in a field. And so what we want to see is two types. We want to see the capitalized, and we want to see lowercase, right, for fields. And if you have a look, we've actually told you, like suburb, I would want to see all suburbs in capitalized format, which means I would have to use a greater than sign in my format command, or format property, right? And obviously if it's a greater than sign, to get lowercase, the format ID is a lowercase. Okay, right. So let's do that. I'm going to switch over. And I've switched over to here, so I know my suburb. I want to always see all the data which is saved in suburb as capital. So in the format part, I would actually just put in a greater than sign. Okay, and for my address, I would always want to see address, so format, so display the data in address in lowercase, so everything will be lowercase. So even if I've saved something in capitalized in address, the format command will grab that data and actually show it all in lowercase, right? And I want to do the same thing here for state. I'm going to say, because I want to see my 3-digit for state in capitalized format. Okay, and that completes the exercise. Don't forget to save. Right? Completes the exercise for module 8.1. I'll see you in 8.2 in a second.